Good afternoon to many of you who are in the East Coast and to the further to the east of us. For those of us folks who are joining from the West Coast or middle of the country here in the US, good morning. It is great to have everybody with us here today for this J Street Policy Center webinar. In which we are going to be talking about a symposium report that the J Street Policy Center just put out within the last couple of days. And we are very excited to have a couple of great experts with us today to discuss that report. And I'm just giving it a moment here for folks to trickle into the chat. And I think we're just going to get started. So in terms of just a very quick background, the J Street Policy Center has been holding twice annual symposia since it was founded a couple of years ago. And our most recent symposium, which we held in October, was about Middle East policy under the next administration, reflecting back a little bit on the Biden administration's almost 4 years of foreign policy on Israel, Palestine, and the broader Middle East, and also looking forward to the next 4 years. This, of course, being in October, was before the November election. And so we considered the policies that a Harris-Walz administration, should it have been elected, should pursue on Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East. Obviously, that did not happen in November, so we're not going to talk about those recommendations here on this webinar, sad as most of us may be about that. Instead, we're going to talk about the other thing that we discussed in our symposium, which was the possibility of a victory by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And we talked about what we would expect and what the strategy should be in the event of such a victory. And we obviously will be talking about that here today. So very excited about this conversation. I believe that it looks like a link to the symposium report is indeed in the chat. So folks have an opportunity to take your time and have a look at that offline as you like to do so. So just a couple of reminders here. In our J Street Policy Center webinars, it's always a priority for us to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions. And so let me just remind you that at any point during the webinar, you are invited, encouraged to submit questions to the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will take as many of those as we can and have time for in our webinar. I'll also just remind you that recordings of our discussions, our webinars, are always available to you both on the J Street Policy Center webpage, accessible from the J Street main page. And you can also watch them on J Street's YouTube channel. They're available for you to watch and available for you to share. And the link, of course, courtesy of my colleagues, is right there in the chat for you. So with all of that said, I'm very excited to introduce our two speakers who are with us today. And both of them were participants in our expert symposium and featured speakers at that symposium. So I'm very pleased to welcome Andrew Miller, who many of you will know. He is now a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. And very significantly for our purposes here today, he recently served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department from 2022 until earlier this year. And so he has very valuable experience and expertise to share with us today. We are also very pleased and privileged to have with us Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. Dahlia is a fellow at the Century Institute She is also a public opinion expert, an international political and strategic consultant, a scholar, a writer, author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, which was published just a little bit over a year ago. And we are very excited to have her taking some time out from attending the Netanyahu trial to join us here today. And I'm not kidding. That is what she has been up to. Okay, fantastic. So good to have the two of you join us today. What I'd love to do actually is something that we would not have been planning when we first started thinking about doing today's webinar. And that is talking a little bit actually about the big news in the Middle East, which of course are the stunning developments in Syria with the dramatic and sudden fall of the Assad regime. And so with the benefit of having two excellent experts with us here today, I do want to take a moment to talk about this. And I'd like to start with you, Andrew Miller, to get your perspective on what exactly is going on the ground in Syria. How do we understand it? And particularly, how is the Biden administration handling this sudden set of developments? Andrew.
Thanks, Deborah. And it's great to be here with you and Dahlia and participating in another J Street broadcast. Syria certainly was not on our bingo card. It wasn't in October when we held the symposium, but as we've seen repeatedly over the last year and several months, it turns out that actors on the ground have their own free will and aren't going to accommodate electoral timetables in the United States or any other democratic government, and now dealing with the fallout from Syria. It is mystifying at a certain level, given that the conflict had been ongoing for 13, 14 years. It appeared to have stabilized largely, and then suddenly, within less than 2 weeks, you had a complete transformation and the removal of this regime, which had been in power for over 50 years. And that in of itself is going to attract attention. It's really hard to speculate on what it means at this point in time, but I think 2 points are undeniable. One is that Assad's ouster, regardless of what happens subsequently, is a long overdue measure of justice for the hundreds of thousands of victims of his reign, of his father's reign in power. That doesn't guarantee there will be a better Syria in his wake, but it is a necessary condition. Notwithstanding hopes surrounding Bashar al-Assad when he assumed power upon his father's death in 2000, obviously any reformist tendencies were soon quashed or proved to be illusory. So I don't want to understate that, and I think it's important that we acknowledge how momentous and how significant it is for Syrian people, so many of whom have suffered and lost loved ones during this long conflict. The second point is the Syrian people and the Syrian factions who have led this military campaign, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Syrian National Army and its elements. They have an uphill struggle to rebuild the country, to say the least. And establishing a more accountable representative government is always difficult. It's going to be a particularly tall order under these circumstances. Syria is a country, as we know, with major ethnic and sectarian cleavages, which will be hard to overcome. And in addition to those internal divisions and fissures, the role of various external actors over the past 13 years have clearly exacerbated the conflict and made it more intense, more deadly than it would be otherwise. Some of the actors are at least momentarily neutralized, but I think we can be confident they will seek to shape events to suit their interest in the coming weeks and months, and that's going to provide a difficult balancing act for any Syrian actors aspiring to leadership over the entirety of the country. And there are multiple scenarios. The ideal scenario of a more democratic Syria is not, unfortunately, the most likely at this point. You could see a consolidation of authority under HTS or some combination of actors, but along authoritarian lines. And given the history and the background of HTS and some of these other groups, there are concerns not only about authoritarianism but about an extremist agenda that they may seek to impose at some time in the future. So we need to be very conscious, very, very conscious of that. Another possibility, which may be the most likely of all, is that Syria will not be wholly put back together, and that there will be competing power centers within Syrian territory for the foreseeable future. From a US perspective, I think as the Biden administration is looking at this, and then as the Trump administration looks at it, there are several interests that are going to be paramount. I think the first is preventing the resurgence of ISIS or the emergence of other terrorist groups, particularly those terrorist groups that have external ambitions, that seek to conduct attacks in the West or against Western targets. The second is forestalling additional refugee outflows, which proved so destabilizing during the height of the war, surging humanitarian aid to meet the needs of the people, and importantly, ensuring the appropriate conditions for refoulement. We've already seen some European countries suspend the asylum process. Turkey, other countries are going to be pushing refugees to return. Many of them are going to want to do so, but we have a responsibility to ensure that we're not encouraging them to do so until the appropriate conditions exist for them to have dignified lives back in Syria. And we certainly can't make that judgment as of yet. The third, I think, core interest is denying Syria's use as a platform for hostile external actors, especially those that are anti-Israel or are opponents of our partners on the ground, including the Kurds with whom we've worked. And that certainly includes Russia and Iran. It includes Turkey, at least as relates the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and other Kurdish entities. But there's also concern about how some of our partners, and Turkey is a NATO ally, are going to operate in Syria and what impact that will have. That includes Israel. Even if we share the underlying motivations behind Israeli actions, there is a risk that Israeli action could exacerbate the situation. So I think the single most development that could potentially take place is the emergence of a cohesive Syrian government that is more protective of the rights of all Syrians. That's morally desirable, and it's probably the best way to secure the interest I just identified. What makes this moment so challenging for the United States is the limits on what the US can do, particularly regarding the emergence of a Syrian government that meets those qualifications. And I think we need to emphasize, and the administration has done a good job of this, that the transition and governance in Syria should be Syrian-led and must be Syrian-led. If they're going to have any legitimacy, if they're going to be responsive to the Syrian people's needs, if they're going to be democratic in orientation, they can't be driven from abroad. Too much overt US influence could compromise that project, so we need to be very judicious in how we do become involved. That's not to say that there isn't a role for the United States, and we saw President Trump on Truth Social say non-intervention. I think I would largely agree with that from a military perspective, but there are diplomatic roles the United States could play without choosing sides that might be helpful. And in that vein, I think the best thing we could do is use our diplomatic and other forms of influence to try to keep the external players at bay. If we can enforce a cordon sanitaire and try to prevent both our allies and partners and our adversaries from unduly influencing the direction of the transition in Syria, that would be a major accomplishment. And that's one that can be largely done outside of Syria's borders. So it wouldn't impinge on the Syrian people's own self-determination and right to determine their own government. I think it is in our interest to engage with HTS directly, notwithstanding its, to put it mildly, checkered history. We should be very careful to avoid endorsing or backing any Syrian faction until we're confident, one, in the motivations for their actions and what those actions are, and as well whether they command genuine support from the Syrian people. If either of those conditions is lacking, we may play a role in propping up or supporting that faction, but it's unlikely to be able to govern in a way that benefits the Syrian people, that is responsive to their needs, and ultimately that is responsive to the needs of the broader global community regarding Syria. So we definitely need to be careful, and this is a moment, thinking back to President Reagan, trust but verify. Maybe not even trust in this case, but definitely verify. Let's see what they do in practice. And to be fair, HTS has done what HTS has said so far has been encouraging. The leader, who now goes by his birth name, Ahmed Sha'ara, previously Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. For those of you non-Arabic speakers, yes, that is a reference to the Golan Heights. So his abandonment of that name might be seen as a gesture towards Israel, that he's not looking to reignite the conflict. But nevertheless, even if he does have the best of intentions, it's not clear that he's going to be able to achieve them within his organization, let alone with the other actors who are going to be necessary to govern Syria. I don't think HTS, at least at this point in time, is capable of governing Syria as a whole. They have to do it in partnership with a wide variety of factions. Just a couple other points, and then I'll close out. One, I don't think we should lift sanctions at this point, consistent with the wait and see attitude, but there are things we can do short of that to provide some degree of economic and humanitarian relief. Under existing sanctions authorities, things called general licenses, which are issued by the Treasury Department, or comfort letters, are often sent out or often issued, which reassure humanitarian organizations, commercial operators, banks, that the US government has no intention of pursuing sanctions in certain areas. And I think additional GLs, as they're known, general licenses and comfort letters, are appropriate under these circumstances to ensure that both humanitarian aid increases, but also that some of the necessary commercial products are starting to enter. The reconstruction task is enormous. We've estimated the bill in Gaza at 80 billion. Imagine what it is for a country the size of Syria. So we need to provide that relief, and we can play a role without lifting the designations up front. Finally, I do think it is appropriate to sustain the presence, the U.S. military presence of 900 individuals in the Northeast for the time being. But one, as I indicated before, we have to be careful not to make this about us. We certainly should go after ISIS as necessary, but no more than is necessary. This shouldn't be viewed as open hunting season where we choose to engage every single potential target that emerges. We should try to be very disciplined in how we exercise that force. And two, ultimately, that should not be a permanent presence. We should be thinking proactively about the conditions and circumstances in which the United States could withdraw those forces. And I think that's very much consistent with the broad feeling amongst the American public that we don't want to remain in these wars, in these conflicts indefinitely. This may provide an opportunity in the coming months to remove those forces, but for the time being, given that it's only 900 individuals, it's probably prudent to keep them there for the time being. So I'll turn it over with that.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. And let me just say, folks, the obvious, which is this topic really could and should be its own webinar. There is so much, obviously, to say about these hugely significant developments that are happening in Syria. But Dahlia, I'd love to get your view from Israel. Obviously, the dramatic fall of the Assad regime is a huge development as far as Israelis are concerned. We know that Netanyahu has basically taken credit for it, that Israel has been significantly, shall we say, militarily involved, taking advantage of the fall of the Assad regime to decimate, more than decimate, actually, the Syrian Navy, the Syrian Air Force. And so, Dahlia, what's the view from Israel? And how does it impact? How does all of this, I mean, as part of the broader picture, obviously, of the dramatic developments since October 7th of last year, how does all of this impact Israel's strategic positioning within the region?
Thanks, Deborah, and thank you, Andrew, for a great opening. I think it's a great, you gave me a great segue because, your warning that America should be careful not to make this all about us is basically diametrically opposed to what Israel has done, which is precisely to make it all about Israel, in the sense of, as Deborah correctly pointed out, Netanyahu very quickly not only taking credit, I mean, it was kind of portrayed as this is all about the success and the vindication of Israel's military campaigns over the last year, but particularly he included very specifically the war in Gaza and on Hamas as a piece of that. And I think that is very central to how Israelis are seeing this. It's part of their collective, psychological defense of what Israel's been doing in Gaza and, of course, against Hezbollah. But frankly, that's an easier case to make to begin with. And so it's clearly being seen as a good, positive development. Sometimes the dangers are even sort of, maybe an afterthought, at least in the public discourse. But obviously the government is not seeing those dangers as an afterthought. As you again correctly point out, it would be hard to miss that Israel took, frankly, what is an unprecedented, I think it's pretty well documented that this is an unprecedented action to destroy such vast amounts of another country's military capacity at all levels, and a country that you're not in an active war with. I mean, yes, it's true that Israel and Syria only have a ceasefire historically, but I don't think this is really something we've seen before. And so that is a dramatic sort of Israeli intervention at this stage. Obviously, Israel is aware of the dangers that come next. And so I think that he is certainly taking, hoping that this is part of his grander strategy to cripple the Iranian axis. And what has happened, there's no question objectively on the ground that Iran is in a weaker position than it has been really at any time that we've seen in the last couple of decades. Its entire kind of regional strategy, strategic depth, building this network, it's pretty much, in many ways collapsed with the end of the Assad regime. The other major piece of that is that Israel's big concern is, what happens with Hezbollah now? And I think there's a great understanding, or maybe I shouldn't say great understanding, but there's a general assessment that Hezbollah really can't be rearmed through Syria anymore. The political conditions are not there. The physical conditions are not there. Israel, of course, has been continuing through this whole time, but stepping up in recent weeks, even before this offensive began, had continued and ratcheted up again its bombing of, weapons transfers through Syria. And so there's no question that it would be, I think that there's no real, scenario right now in which Hezbollah is able to rearm in that sense. However, that doesn't remove Israel's fear that Hezbollah is still, present and a clear and present danger in Lebanon, even though it has been somewhat more restrained and, of course, severely weakened by the attacks. So I think that is going to be the other major thing on Israel's mind is what happens really with Hezbollah, and what does it continue doing in Lebanon. And therefore, I think that let me go back to Iran for a second. When you ask about Israel's strategy and how this affects Israel in the Middle East, it very much starts with how Iran deals with this and what is Iran's positioning after having, suffered this, very significant weakening of its entire strategy. So I think Iran will have to decide whether it takes a path, one of at least two paths that I can see. One is whether it accelerates its nuclear program. And I think that is the first an overriding concern of the Israelis, and it's not only Israelis who think that, and I mean, frankly, this was already a concern going several months back, that given at least going back to Israel's escalation against Hezbollah following Hezbollah's deeply, wrongful and unstrategic and mistaken and immoral, escalation on October 8th. But so I always try to preface, try to put that in there when we talk about Israel's escalation against Hezbollah. But I think there was already a fear that Iran's response to kind of being backed into, this corner would be to accelerate its nuclear program. That is much more front and center in the Israeli discourse right now. And Iran is also going to have to decide whether it really takes significant activity to try to rearm Hezbollah. It's worth pointing out that Iran was, in a strange way, the restraining force on Hezbollah from going full force against Israel during the course of these 14 months. And so Iran might say, well, everything we've done turned out not to work, so let's, go in this full force direction on those two paths. The alternative would be that Iran says, well, we've been significantly weakened and we have to, let some sort of back channel diplomacy take its course, and we'll maybe try to revive a diplomacy-based approach with the West, which is something that the U.S. administration might have wanted, might still want. We don't know. So that's like, the junctions for Iran. And with Israel, I think that there are two major things that are on my mind about what Israel will be deciding to do. One is essentially whether it keeps its forces or keeps a very, very strong and escalatory military, I don't know how to put it, presence willingness to escalate in Lebanon despite the ceasefire, right? There's basically been ongoing trading of fire, or trading of accusations of violations or real violations. There's constant, action still in Lebanon despite the ceasefire, and that could really continue if Israel decides that Hezbollah is still a significant threat. The other thing is that Israel has moved into the buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria, on the other side of the Golan Heights with Syria. And that's the buffer zone that was established in the 1974 ceasefire that has remained a buffer zone without any military forces this whole time. So it's unprecedented. Israel says that the rebels were approaching and they were possibly going to attack UN forces. That has been confirmed by the IDF that was the concern, and that's why the forces are there. I think there's it's hard for me to say what the Israeli government is thinking about this, but I can tell you that, my contacts around the Middle East are deeply concerned that Israel has, expansionist and imperial designs to stay in these places. And if that language sounds extreme, try pushing back on it. When you see how Israel has, undertaken its actions over the last year and a half, Israel has its justifications. We can argue them, but I think there is a very, serious fear that Israel will do that. And then the other major thing that I think we should be looking out for is that Israel will be making a stronger case, given what I said before about the possibility of Iran moving, accelerating on nuclear weapons grade nuclear development, that Israel will be making a stronger case for taking military action against Iran, directly against its nuclear program, with the possible, if it senses that it has the backing of the U.S., doubtfully under this regime, more likely under the next, administration, and more likely under the next administration. I think that's still, then this gets to the third axis in this triangle, which is the US. And I think we all probably understand by now that there are competing tendencies within the new incoming Trump administration. One is a little more isolationist. We don't want to see more of these escalations. These wars would never have started if Trump was in place to begin with, as Trump had been there, and he wants to, prove that he can stabilize everything. And on the other side of his, of his axis are more interventionist voices who believe that only military action speaks in the Middle East. Only military action can restrain Iran. Back channels of diplomacy are all well and good, but this year has proven what the Israeli hawks have been saying, that the military strategies are vindicated. And one final note that, there's another major decision Israel has to make, and that's what it does with relation to Gaza. There's high anticipation at this point that there's a new possibility of a hostage release ceasefire deal, but I still think we should assume that that means very little in terms of long-term de-escalation in Gaza. And while all of these other big big regional dynamics are in place, I would say we can assume that Israel will be, under the cover of that action, assuming that the world is focused on the Middle East, it will continue its activities in Gaza that are laying the ground, if this government has its way, laying the groundwork for, occupation, establishment of a military government, settlement, and needless to say, in the West Bank as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much for that excellent analysis. Now, I do want to move us in the direction of our symposium and our symposium report. And all of this, what we've just discussed, obviously happened under the watch of the Biden administration. So let me take us back a little bit to the Biden administration here. And Andrew, I'm going to come to you first, but just to kind of preface this conversation a little bit, you know, Biden administration, you know, key national security officials, they were basically aiming to try to keep the Middle East portfolio off of Biden's desk, keep everything quiet. In fact, you had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan right before October 7th, celebrating in a piece that he wrote that they had succeeded in this, right? That everything was quiet, everything was going well. Then October 7th happens. And so I'm going to put a number of big questions on your plate, and I apologize. I'm going to ask you to, keep this as short as we can, just because our time is limited. We could talk about this for a long time. But questions for your plate here. One, key assessments of Biden administration foreign policy, both on the Middle East, on Israel, Palestine, pre-October 7th, and then, post-October 7th, war in Gaza. That's our first thing. That's a huge thing in and of itself. I recognize this. But I also want to take a moment to talk about, what is commonly referred to as the lame duck period, right? Which President Biden is now in, the period after the November election until he leaves office on January 20th. This was a major topic of our symposium, and it's something that J Street has talked quite a bit about, right? That this is this important period where political pressures are gone. Previous administrations have taken some pretty significant steps during this lame duck period vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, and the Middle East, right? And there's a real desire for something very, for the Biden administration to kind of write its legacy on this issue. So my questions for you then on this, Andrew, are, what do you think that the Biden administration needs to do? And I know you have a lot of, and we've written in the symposium report some very important recommendations. But second, here we are over a month into the lame duck period, and we've seen very little. What is your hope that that's going to turn around? And why haven't we seen action? I'm sure many of our viewers want to understand, and I know you still have contacts with your former colleagues in the State Department. Give us a sense of what's going on here, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Deborah. So in terms of key assessments of administration policy, before and after October 7th, there is a counterfactual in which, President Biden, honored his original or stuck with his original inclination to be a single-term president, and this gamble that diverting resources outside of the Middle East to other areas could have held off through 4 years. And if that had happened, he would have looked like a genius, and his team would have all looked like geniuses and would be considered a monumentally successful foreign policy. And it's, in other areas, the performance has been by no means perfect. No president's perfect, but it has been impressive in terms of how they've managed Ukraine. A lot of criticism of the slow response as some people see it, but that strikes me as prudent, and they're still in a position where the Ukrainians are fighting, and obviously we have Trump coming in, but had Harris Trump, won in the election, I think the pathway to a satisfactory resolution in Ukraine would have looked very, very good. We would have been in a better position vis-a-vis China. Our position in international organizations would be much stronger. We forget now that the administration actually did a fair amount to shore up U.S. interests within the international system prior to October 7th, re-engaging UNRWA, Human Rights Council, competing with China. We saw in the votes on Ukraine that the United States was regularly winning by decisive margins. So there was success and there was discipline. One of the criticisms of most administrations is that they're unable to adhere to their priorities. The administration is the exception. They adhered to them rigorously. The problem was that there was this blind spot with respect to the Middle East. And obviously, it's easy to say in hindsight, but they severely underestimated the risk that there would be an explosion in the region. And I think they confused de-escalation with stability. And it was true that there was de-escalation in terms of tensions declining, but it wasn't declining towards an equilibrium. It was just a temporary trend that could reverse itself at any time, and it did. It just didn't happen until October 7th, 2023. And since then, I do think that in the grand scheme of things, the administration could have done far worse in containing the conflict. Obviously, it had spread to Lebanon. The Houthis became involved. Fire from Syria, from Iraq, the exchanges with Iran, but we didn't see the full-scale regional war that we had all been concerned about. In other areas, I think the accomplishments have been very limited. We still have 100 hostages approximately in Gaza. The Israeli military has succeeded in degrading both Hamas and Hezbollah, but that's not a guarantee of future stability. Both organizations theoretically could stage a comeback, and even if they didn't, there are new threats that could emerge. As I've told some Israeli officials, there actually are things worse than Hamas, and that's not to in any way belittle the significance of what Hamas did, but there are even more pernicious types of environments and organizations that you could be left with. But from a broader American perspective, more than anything, what this war has done is, one, it has shattered our international reputation, and it's isolated Israel to a greater extent than ever before. The prime minister and the former defense minister are unable to travel to certain countries because they're afraid of being arrested. That is a seismic development and a clear sign of the degree to which, in some ways, the progress of normalization has been reversed, and Israel is more of a pariah than it was before. Similar with the United States, we don't have the level of support in international organizations we did before. The votes that we were winning, we are now losing. We're getting a lot of votes where we're the outlier, we're vetoing, we're trying to oppose. So we've, in a form of jujitsu, turned the force back on ourselves and injured our own position. The second concerning development, and Dahlia referenced this multiple times, it is what Iran does. And while Iran is clearly weakened, and while its proxy network is at a lower state than it has been, arguably in 20 years, we may have unintentionally forced their hand in terms of pursuing a nuclear option. And there simply is not a good solution there other than a negotiated agreement. And even with a negotiated agreement, how is Iran going to respond? Prior to what happened in Syria, there were some encouraging signs that Trump was speaking, or his people in the circle were speaking with Iranian officials and vice versa. But if you're Iran and you're looking at it, you no longer have this proxy network to defend you. You only have nuclear weapons. Does that drive up the price for what Iran would need to get to back off on its nuclear development? Or does it mean, in fact, that Iran is going to be less willing to make certain concessions than it would before? It's going to have new red lines that didn't exist previously. And while military action is always out there, it exists as an option. Even those who are supportive of it recognize it's at best a temporary postponement of the problem, and that in the long term it may actually make it worse, because it would allow Iran to reconstitute the program in such a way that it would be more difficult to detect, more difficult to access, and more difficult to prosecute. So in all of those respects, I think it's a loss for the United States and a net loss for the Israelis. And that this isn't even touching on the Palestinian dynamic, where we're at the point where Gaza, has Gazan society has more or less ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Now, putting aside questions of political, which were the focus of our negotiations and of our discussions with Israel, with Palestinian actors, what should the relationship between Gaza and the West Bank be? Gaza doesn't exist in the same form it did before. There's not just no government, there's no civil society, there's no broader societal connection. It's essentially a giant refugee camp. If it went from being an open air prison, now it's a giant refugee camp within a prison, where people don't even have the necessary supplies to support themselves on a daily basis. And the long-term implications of that are going to have, I think, a long tail, and I'm very concerned about what they may be. Looking at the situation, this transitions into why we haven't seen anything. You're always looking at things as a snapshot in time, and at any given time things may look better or worse, but that snapshot in and of itself does not necessarily represent a trend. A trend, you need to piece together multiple snapshots as well as an assessment of what the next snapshot's going to look like. Based on what we've heard from the administration, we haven't heard the same degree of triumphalism, of celebration that Dahlia mentioned from Prime Minister Netanyahu. But we did see President Biden essentially say from the White House that under my administration, we've weakened Lebanon and Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran more than they ever have before. So I'm concerned that there are those in the administration who may also feel vindicated by this recent turn of events, which reduces the incentive to engage in a variety of areas. The one area where I do expect to see some action, and I don't know that, I'm very skeptical of what it's going to produce, is on some type of hostage deal. Like Dahlia, I do not think this is going to be the hostage deal that was contemplated by the Biden administration over the past year, in which you would have Israeli withdrawal, in which it would constitute a real end to the war, but some type of arrangement in which there's a reduction in operations for the release of hostages. The administration genuinely cares about the hostages, wants them home. If they can't get it done, I think they will get it done. They may not be able to. That may wait for Trump, and perhaps it will occur in that situation. But that's not enough. Hostages are essential, and they're a key priority for both the United States and Israel, but that doesn't provide for long-term security. That doesn't reduce the likelihood of more violence, and it certainly does nothing to promote a longer-term future in which Israelis and Palestinians live in peace and security alongside each other, in whatever form that takes. That has clearly been set back immeasurably. But I really haven't heard discussions on some of the other issues we had contemplated and we discussed previously during the symposium, including reversing some of the regressive Trump-era policies that haven't been overturned on product labeling, making another move on the consulate, potentially increasing the seniority of the head of the Office of Palestinian Affairs. with UNRWA, we had restored it. Now we're in a place where it's been cut off, and there really hasn't been administration engagement on trying to reverse that. I haven't heard any indication that the president is considering giving an address to the Israeli people, warning that as one of Israel's longest-term supporters, he's concerned about the country's direction, and they have some difficult decisions to make. I have not heard that there's an appetite for designating either Ben-Gvir or Smotrich under the West Bank executive order, although, as we discussed at the symposium, from a legal perspective, there is sufficient evidence. It's merely a political barrier. And then in terms of accountability measures, those could be that's one area that could be pursued independently of the administration, and I strongly recommend that we do, engaging with the general, with the Inspector General of the State Department to look into issues regarding implementation of the Leahy Law, the 620I provision regarding humanitarian assistance impediments, the Shireen Abu Akleh case, and I haven't heard anything regarding the site of the new American embassy. And I'm just left with the conclusion that, one, it's partly they think they're in a better position than they were before, so there's less the president has to do. Second, Trump is the elephant in the room, and without his active cooperation, it's difficult to get things done. Where they got it in Lebanon, they were able to achieve a ceasefire, which, as Dahlia noted, has existed in theory more than in practice. And then third, that there simply is there remains a conceptual psychological barrier to go further than the administration has. That the president himself, as well as his senior advisors, who either share his views independently or have been co-opted by those views, just can't contemplate taking some of the actions that we would recommend that may look on the surface to be antagonistic towards Israel, but are actually intended to be in Israel's long-term interest. So this really does concern me. And I'll just close by saying, even if the triumphalists are right about what's happened to Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, all that means is we've basically undone the damage from the 2003 Iraq War. We're not in a better position than we were in 2002 or 2000 or 1998 vis-a-vis the Middle East. We've simply gone back to the period before the greatest strategic blunder in our history. So even if there is progress, even if this holds, it's not the boon, it's not the transformation in the United States position in the world that some would want to hope. And given Prime Minister Netanyahu's enthusiastic advocacy and lobbying for the Iraq War, again, he played a role in unleashing these trends on himself and on Israel and on the United States. And at best, they have served to negate some of those effects.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. Now, Dahlia, I know that you have a pretty hard stop at the top of the hour. So we've got some time to hear from you before you have to jump. And so what I'd love for you to do in the time that we have left is, before you have to leave us, unfortunately, is for you to reflect a little bit on Biden administration, where we are in the lame duck. But I would also really love for you to as well look forward to the next 4 years, what you foresee as, Trump and Netanyahu, that partnership again returns, and what you think that the progressive community needs to do, during those 4 years to, in the optimistic scenario that we have elections again in 4 years and maybe have a change, what we need to do to prepare ourselves for that. So I know that's a lot, but over to you, Dahlia.
It's a lot. It's that I don't have good answers for that. I mean, I have to be very honest. There's the opportunities are pretty limited, and I would be very happy to just respond to many of the things that Andrew said, but I don't want to, take up time with that. But I mean, most basically, the bottom line is I agree with everything you said. And I would maybe add just one more, well, two quick comments on some stuff that Andrew said. I think that the psychological block of the U.S. administration, I think maybe should be a little more front and center, right? I think we heard repeatedly, and you can confirm this if it sounds right, that the president himself is the one who was unable to undertake many of these things that might have been bitter medicine, but ultimately would have helped Israel. So that's a part of it. And the second thing that I would like to pick up on, just because I am genuinely curious about it, it was a fascinating point that you made about the region, if there is any sort of success to what's happened, that it's basically gone back to where we were in 2003 before so much of the damage that was done based on the Iraq War. Is that categorical, or do we have a slightly different trajectory forward because of the Arab Spring? I mean, this feels to me like, the kind of expectation for what Syria might become is partly inspired by what it wanted to do, what those rebels wanted to do, at least those who were democratically oriented. And is that going to open up some sort of opportunity if the other parties don't screw it up, excuse my language, with the wrong kind of intervention? So I think those are things we might want to consider. And in fact, maybe it does open up the question of the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, which, when we think of Biden as having a sort of older generation, very emotional attachment to, what Israel wants means being pro-Israel, doesn't quite have that, right? He had a good relationship with Netanyahu before and agreed with him on a lot of stuff and rolled with him on a lot of stuff. Their relationship has gone through its ups and downs since then. We know that Trump is willing to break he doesn't prize any relationship if he loses loyalty. And so everything is conditional for him. And, maybe they will not see eye to eye on everything. For example, Trump's various hints over the course of this year that Israel's got to stop the war in Gaza. We don't know if he means it or not, but if he's not feeling favorably inclined toward Netanyahu, I don't think he has the sentimentality of the previous generation's kind of ultra, ground floor loyalty to what Israel's government wants. So that may be something to keep in mind. That was the good news. Okay. The less good news is that I do think Trump, has this, when I talked about the two kind of competing forces of more isolationist versus more interventionist types within him, I think we also have people with different, individuals who are influential on him with competing loyalties. We don't know how competitive they are yet. I mean, I think that, his newest in-law advisor, Bulos, we know if exactly knows what his vision is for the Middle East right now. I see Andrew shaking his head, so I know I'm onto something. But I have heard this from people who are a little better, well placed, and I think that that's one thing. But still, there's sort of an expectation that he's not exactly where the Friedman-Kushner axis is. And if those are all influential figures, we don't know exactly which direction this will take. But let's say Trump continues to be influenced by, Kushner, Friedman, or people representing that camp. It could very well be that there will be a dark quid pro quo here, in which Trump says, to Netanyahu something like, "Let's make a deal. You give us de-escalation in the Middle East. We let you kind of, continue with your annexationist policies in the West Bank and maybe even Gaza." I mean, I threw that out to some other, former American policymakers who thought, no, it doesn't quite work like that. So I don't know if I'm right or wrong. It could be completely wrong, but I think of the way Trump makes his decisions tends to be very transactional and, again, non-sentimental and non-ideology driven. So that's one possibility. Or it could be the reverse. He may be more influenced to say, fine, we'll give you the backing to continue escalating in the Middle East because we've been influenced by the hawkish militarist approach to Iran. We share that. We're willing to, let you take the lead on this, and we will back what we need to do, militarily and politically, et cetera. But let's end the war in Gaza already. It's enough. We're sick of this. Like Trump had dropped those hints even earlier this year. So either one of those transactional directions is, certainly very exceedingly dangerous. And I'm sorry to paint a negative picture, but I think those are the things that I would look out for in the next Trump administration. Of course, what the personal relationship becomes with Netanyahu. And there's another, kind of third way that sounds a little crazy right now, but hey, we're in a week where we've seen things that nobody expected. If the Biden administration in its parting, weeks and months, or the Trump administration, because who knows, decides that it wants to get back to this idea that a hostage release deal and a ceasefire should be part of a bigger, re-engineering of the Middle East along the lines of an American and Israel-led axis, but that involves, normalization with Saudi Arabia, which means we assume Saudi is being more serious about the price of a Palestinian state. and this does get to the question of what progressives should do. Basically, I think progressives should support something like that if it becomes a major multilateral, global effort that includes the US, Europe, which has been completely ineffective this entire time. And I hear European diplomats constantly searching for what to do better, and Middle Eastern, like-minded Middle Eastern Arab governments to support a big historic, proposal that involves, very explicit statements, not piecemeal, one here, one Saudi-led global alliance there, and one possible, peace conference there. I mean, it's just too scattered. But if all those efforts come together and there is a big comprehensive vision of what it could be, that will be harder for the Israelis to ignore. And especially if it is, somehow growing out of a hostage release deal and a ceasefire in Gaza. Imagine that kind of thing is on the table in some fantasy land, and it could seriously divide the Israeli coalition. Let's say it topples the government. Let's say it becomes the issue in the next elections. Who knows? The other, the alternative scenario, and maybe even more likely right now, is that Netanyahu, having got this triumphant perspective on what happens in the Middle East, or what has happened in the Middle East, portrays it as this great victory, which he has been doing, reaches a hostage release deal that is very limited, the more likely scope that I think we talked about, but nevertheless gets an incredible wave of public support in Israel, because we know that the vast majority of Israelis support a hostage release deal, and then decides he's in the best position to go for elections and wins those next elections. That's also a possibility. But we don't know what will happen in elections. So there are plenty of unknowns here. I don't want to overstate how much we can know, but I think all these paths are possible. And one of them, at least one of them, or one and a half of them, might lead to a change of government in Israel too. And those are the kinds of things progressives should support, particularly the big comprehensive vision. But I mean, how can, a progressive American Jewish community looking for what to do call up all those world leaders and say, get together with this big comprehensive vision? I don't know, but I mean, at least we can start articulating it.
Thanks so much for that, Dahlia. And again, because I know you need to leave in just a couple minutes, I just want to put one more question to you. And then Andrew has been kind enough he'll stay a little bit beyond the hour. And so I do want to put some questions to him as well for folks who are able to stay. My question for you, Dahlia, I noted at the very top of the hour that you've been spending some time over the past couple of days attending Netanyahu's trial. So I'm just wondering if you can bring a little bit more Netanyahu's current situation, right? Bring those worlds together. And, how are these developments, the international, regional developments, and his trial domestically, how is all of that impacting together when it comes to Israeli politics?
Well, remember that yesterday was the first time ever that an Israeli sitting prime minister had to give testimony in his own trial. It's, of course, because everything is unprecedented. We never had an Israeli prime minister who was on trial, because the other two Israelis who came close to indictment resigned ahead of their indictments, or ahead of their legal proceedings or prosecutions. And we all remember Ehud Olmert, but you might not remember that the first one is Yitzhak Rabin in the 1970s. So we've never been in this situation before. There was very little question in my mind, and I was frankly correct to note that the first day of his testimony was, I would say about 70 to 80% him using his time to give long speeches about his entire life and his career and his history and the country's history, the country's prehistory, kind of inserting himself at every juncture in Israeli life to continue making the case to Israelis that he is a key figure in Israel's development at all levels, economic, political, liberalizing developments, and that he is the country's most, seasoned statesman. And he certainly talked about the situation in the Middle East. He called it a tectonic shift, and he likened it to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He said this is the biggest realignment in the Middle East since the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was all a way of saying, I need to be free to do that, and I need to be the one leading Israel to chart it through those waters. So that, yesterday was, of course, also the day with the greatest amount of attention. That was, I mean, listen, the courtroom was packed today too, but not for the whole day. And he also only started later in the day. But I think that he knew that it was basically he is fighting, he really is fighting the charges, and he was much more, impassioned about the actual legal cases against him, which, he tends to characterize as, fictional and conveying, this time not in so many words, but his lawyer does that for him, conveying that they're all fabricated because they're just, represent a sort of, legal precedent or unprecedented legal arguments and fictionalized crimes, and they're all just politically motivated, and the judiciary is responsible for trying to bring him down. But yesterday was really more about reminding Israelis. Some people say, my colleague at Haaretz thinks that he was speaking to his base. I disagree. I think he was trying to portray for the entire country, you need me to lead us through these troubled times. And so, it's not going to mean very much in the short term because the case will take a long time, right? We have no idea how long his testimony will go on. It will probably be at least a matter of weeks. And then, what comes next? It could be another year of deliberations. We might not get a verdict until 2026. And believe me, we're not assured of a conviction in any case. Certainly, we're not assured of a conviction on all three cases. And so we don't know what kind of sentence there will be. If there is a conviction at that time, he would not be able to be prime minister, but that could be so far in advance that we could have gone through 2 election cycles by then. Who knows?
Well, thank you so much for that, Dahlia. Appreciate you taking a couple of extra minutes with us and really appreciate you having us here today to discuss the symposium report and all of these important developments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you also, Andrew, for great insights, and thanks to the audience. Sorry, I have to leave.
Thanks so much. No, that's totally fine. All right, folks who are able to stay with us, please do stay a few extra minutes. We have a number of questions that folks have submitted, and I know Andrew will be very well placed to take them on. So Andrew, if it's okay, what I'd like to do is take some of the questions that we've got. I don't think we'll have time for all of the questions because I don't want to abuse your time too much, but I do want to put some questions to you and would love your insights. So we've got some questions regarding the regional situation. For example, vis-a-vis Syria, question about how you would assess the U.S. role in the end of the Assad regime. There is a related question vis-a-vis Lebanon. What will be the impact of the developments in Syria on Lebanese efforts to return to controlling their own destiny? Obviously, Lebanon, another country that has, suffered from tremendous regional international penetration. So what is the impact there vis-a-vis Lebanon? And then a couple of additional questions. One is going back to international law, international organizations. I mean, this is something that you spoke about. Do you see the U.S. under the Biden administration, and good Lord, now we've got Trump coming in, basically abandoning all pretense of honoring American obligations under the UN Charter, under international law? Obviously, that's a big question. And the last thing that I want to throw at you, Andrew, and please, cover what you can, that we have a question about UNRWA. And our questioner stipulates that starts from the starting point that UNRWA plays a large part, I'm quoting here, in perpetuating the irredentist Palestinian ideology that fuels the conflict. So why do you, per your recommendations, think that the reinstatement of U.S. aid to UNRWA would be a positive thing? So that's a lot, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Deborah. So on international law and international organizations, one note on it, because it relates to something Dahlia said about the 1974 disengagement agreement. That is not something to which the U.S. is indifferent. That's something that Henry Kissinger personally negotiated. He was the witness for the agreement. He specified the terms. It was originally U.S. forces that were in the disengaged zone before UNDOF was created to provide and relay information about what was happening and to assure that there were no violations in the meantime. So the U.S. does have a direct interest in that agreement, which miraculously had held for 50 years. And the administration's somewhat blasé acceptance of Israeli actions as short-term and necessary I found somewhat surprising, given that this wasn't just a bilateral agreement between Israel and Syria, but this was also very much a U.S. agreement. And I would also just note that from a security perspective, uh, the only part of the buffer zone that is actually worth taking is Mount Hermon, but Israel is occupying most of the buffer zone. But even without Mount Hermon, as long as Israel has air superiority, which it does, and that's not going to change, there is no real threat to Israel. So that's not to say that there isn't an advantage. Yes, it makes it easier to prosecute certain threats and to prevent them, but it's by no means necessary. And with the existing facilities on top of Mount Hermon, Israel would be able to seize the high ground to meet well before any militants got anywhere near the border. It just leads me to believe there have to be other considerations at play in why Israel chose to do that. And it could be related to the future disposition of the Golan Heights, because one thing that the Biden administration has said repeatedly is, we're not, not undoing Trump's recognition, but in a future where it's no longer Assad on the other side, then we would have to take a look at it. And this may be an Israeli effort to try to plant the flag and make clear that if we're going to be doing any withdrawal, it's going to be from this additional area that we are located in, but we have every intention of keeping the part of the Golan Heights that that President Trump recognized as falling under Israeli sovereignty previously. The international law is, and the general posture, I think there are two things at play. One of them is, I think President Biden did believe in those objectives at a theoretical level, but his actual commitment to pursuing them was never particularly strong. He was always willing to trade those if there were other interests at stake. And the second reason is, the administration seems to believe that once the wars end, we'll simply go back to where things were. And they juxtaposed this experience with Iraq and said, look, we were in a terrible position after the Iraq war, but we were able to stage a comeback. We were able to retain our position. And that's a fair point. They may be wrong. What I have said in response is, the primary reason we did recover so quickly is that in 2008, we had a historical election in which we elected a president who had a background, or had a family background in the Muslim world, someone who looked more like many folks in the region, and who had an uncanny ability to empathize and express genuine concern for their well-being. Had John McCain been elected president in 2008, and this is not a criticism of McCain, he would be infinitely better than any number of candidates, he would not have been able to pull that off, just because of his identity and his background. So I'm less confident that the damage will be undone quickly. I think ultimately we can, but it's going to be contingent on action. On Syria and what the U.S. role was, I mean, to be very, the U.S. role was indirect. The Syrian people are responsible for what happened. They deserve credit for what happens, and frankly, this is a situation where others may deserve blame for what happens the wrong way. But the ways in which the U.S. contributed to success is, it's clear that support for Ukraine and Russia took Russia out of the equation. It's clear that U.S. support for Israel, particularly vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Iran, played a major role in neutralizing the Iranian role. And it was that external support that kept the illegitimate and increasingly bankrupt, politically, financially, Assad regime in power. So once those were taken off the table, it allowed Syrian native forces to assert themselves in a way they arguably could have done at any point in time in the preceding years, had those external barriers been removed. The other element where the United States, I think, played a role was in keeping the sanctions regime intact amidst efforts by the Emiratis and others to bring Syria back in from the cold. And the lack, while the immediate circle around Assad was able to live in luxury, it's clear that even Syrian army conscripts from his Alawite base were not getting the level of support that they would need to feel compelled to fight for him and to fight for his regime. And that is in no small part due to the fact that we starved the Syrian regime of resources, that we continued to have that effect. And as long as the US kept those sanctions intact, what the UAE others were doing was somewhat incidental, because they still were going to honor American sanctions for fear of facing the legal and economic consequences of doing so. So the US is a supporting player in what happened, and the US created the permissive conditions for what took place, but ultimately that didn't guarantee what happened. What guaranteed the fall of the Assad regime was the resourcefulness, the organization of these of HTS, of these other Syrian army groups, and the willingness of the Syrian people to expose themselves again at a time when it was uncertain that they would be successful, that they could wind up with Assad returning to these areas and brutalizing them. That took a tremendous amount of courage. I mean, Turkey clearly played a major role, and I think the extent of that is going to be more apparent over time, but we don't necessarily have the details. In Lebanon, it definitely matters in terms of Hezbollah and Hezbollah's ability to reconstitute itself quickly. It's going to be more difficult for Iran to move goods, supplies, weapons, money to Hezbollah than it would have been had Syria remained under Assad's control. They'll still find ways to do it. It's just going to be a slower process, and that will keep Hezbollah weaker for longer. The obstacle in Lebanon that doesn't exist to the same degree in Syria is the absence of an alternative. And now Hezbollah is the worst in Lebanon, but if you're looking for a responsive government that is clean, that is corruption-free, that is focused on the interests of the Lebanese people writ large, you're not going to find them. There is no such entity in Lebanon, and there's no prospective entity. We don't know whether such an entity exists in Syria, but we at least see some elements trying to define themselves in that spirit. No one in Lebanon has been able to succeed. Individuals have tried, but they're largely, at this point, younger kids who haven't been able to gain traction as of yet. Maybe they will over time, and maybe the impact of Syria will be to boost their confidence. It will be a model showing that it is possible to achieve change against what seem insurmountable odds. But it's going to take time for Lebanon to build that infrastructure that would allow for a major change in Lebanon. And I do hope that exists. But right now, we essentially have a suicide pact between Hezbollah and every other party. Even those who are opposed to Hezbollah are ultimately in the same boat, because they're equally corrupt, they're equally implicated in the crimes of the past within Lebanon, not equally implicated in actions against Israel and actions against Western interests. But from the Lebanese people's perspective, they are very much the same in a lot of ways. So there could be a Syria effect. There could be a wave that extends over the neighboring country, but I think it's going to take a few years to materialize, if it does materialize. On UNRWA, I understand the argument regarding UNRWA that the existence of UNRWA, a separate organization, plays a role in sustaining the Palestinian refugee population as a distinct population. However, as a practical matter, Palestinian nationalism has been forged, regardless of whether you think it's an invention of the 20th century or if it goes back farther. It's real now. And the Palestinian people genuinely believe in it. And even amidst all of the chaos, you don't have people in Gaza, including refugees or refugees in the West Bank, saying, we have nothing to do with this. They're Gazans, or we're Gazans. We don't care what happens in the West Bank and Jerusalem. We see sympathy, we see solidarity from Palestinian communities in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, in other locations. So if the objective was to prevent a Palestinian identity and a sense that Palestinian refugees were displaced and should be able to return to some type of home, I think that ship has sailed. There's no turning that back. What can be influenced is to where they return. So what does it mean to return to a Palestinian state? Does it mean settling in Gaza, settling in the West Bank, settling in what is now part of East Jerusalem as part of an agreement? Yeah, it could mean all of those things. It doesn't necessarily have to mean returning to Haifa or returning to Jaffa, as some Palestinians hold out hope for. But I don't think that's what UNRWA has done. I don't think UNRWA has kept alive the hope that they're going to be able to return to those areas. I think it's simply it's been less political than it has been life-saving, frankly, where the conditions that the Palestinian refugees face, not just in Gaza, but in other locations, would be impossible without the support of UNRWA. And there's no organization that could do that. Even if you did transfer the responsibilities of UNRWA to UNHCR, for instance, the High Commissioner on Refugees, the cost of this entire operation would probably increase by anywhere from 20 to 100 times. And that's in part because UNRWA does rely on Palestinian labor, which is cheaper, but also ensures that the services provide a beneficial impact on the economy and deliver for even people outside of the refugee sector. So it's a form of social support. It's a form of government economic support for the Palestinian economy writ large that would not be provided if it's largely foreigners, if it's largely external actors who are the ones providing that type of assistance. Now, I'm not saying there aren't problems. There clearly are problems, and they do need to be addressed. And none of that justifies the behavior of Hamas, certainly, or of individual UNRWA members who were either affiliated with Hamas or chose to join in or play some role in what happened on October 7th. There is a problem, with the curriculum. There are a number of issues, but that has less to do with UNRWA than it has to do with the ecosystem in which UNRWA is located. UNRWA cannot do some of the things that they're being asked to do. No UN organization, for instance, does its own background checks. When a UN organization clears an employee, they turn to the local government and say, do you have any information on this individual? In Gaza, who was the local government? It was Hamas. So UNRWA was not going to get reliable information. There was no one else to turn to except Israel. And Israel, by its own admission, was not sharing derogatory information. Israel was receiving complete lists of all of the individuals, of all the Palestinians employed by UNRWA, but they were not providing derogatory information as they saw it to UNRWA to take action on. It was only public cases where work by research institutes uncovered problematic behavior where action was taken, but the Israelis were not providing that information. And they've, in that regard, having spoken with Shin Bet, having spoken with other Israeli security agencies involved, they acknowledged they failed, that they could have done more, and they didn't do that. I also think it's beyond the capacity of UNRWA to deal with the textbooks, because the textbooks is primarily a Palestinian Authority issue. Our problem there, the address is in Ramallah. It's not in UNRWA headquarters. And it would be irresponsible for UNRWA or any organization to train students according to a standard by which they won't be evaluated for further advancement in their education or for future work. You're not going to train them according to a standard that may be very good, but isn't going to be considered sufficient certification in order to enter university or to work in a given sector. So the Palestinian Authority is the obstacle there, and working with them. And that requires more priority. When I was still at the State Department, I had many conversations with the PA about this and about the need to make progress towards that end. And also, while we're unable to provide the US assistance directly to the PA, we were able to find other countries like Germany who were willing to invest in a revision of the Palestinian curriculum, but they weren't willing to do it, partly because the politics made it difficult, but primarily because of a lack of leadership, because of a lack of courage. And that's easy for me to say sitting here, but for Abu Mazen, I think, and those around him who are clinging to life, literally and figuratively, they're not particularly eager to take that up. I think it's fair to say that that could have been a greater priority for the U.S., for the Biden administration in our interactions with the Palestinian Authority. And maybe this is something the Trump administration will pursue with the PA if they remain on good terms with them. I do agree with Dahlia that Trump is fundamentally unpredictable, and his attitude towards Israelis, towards Palestinians, does not reflect any real underlying emotional attachment. It's instrumental. It's whether it serves them. Trump, that by all accounts, does not like Netanyahu. He dislikes him, but he's willing to use him for his purposes and vice versa. I suspect that Netanyahu doesn't like Trump very much either. They're different personalities, even if some of their actions tend to rhyme at a level. So there is an opportunity for Trump to do things that President Biden couldn't do for that reason. And more than anything, President Trump is in a position where if he told the Republican Party that I'm going to take this position, even if it's one that is viewed as controversial within the pro-Israel community, I think the vast majority of Republicans fall in line. There is nothing President Biden could have done to win over those Republican supporters. There's nothing he could have done, and he was going to be tarred and feathered for any action that he took that was perceived as remotely contrary to Israeli interests, including holding a few bombs that were not essential to ongoing Israeli operations. I think Trump could actually do much more if he wanted to, and still rely on the support of his party. But Trump's potential is also his undoing, because he is fundamentally unpredictable. He does not operate in a linear fashion. There isn't a sense of, these are my goals and this is how it's more like, if you remember, I don't know if they still have at restaurants, the little kids menus where you took the crayon and you tried to find the pathway. I think that's how decision-making takes place within the first Trump administration, and likely will take place in the second Trump administration. So it becomes hard to follow the plot. And when Trump does achieve something he intended, it is a very, very circuitous path, to say the least, which makes it hard to influence him in the ways that would be desirable at any given point in time. But we just don't know, and I think there will be a lot of tension between President Trump himself and his advisors. As noted, there are different strands, but I think most of the isolationists are actually not the foreign policy people. They are working in domestic roles, whereas the people in the foreign policy teams or slated for foreign policy positions fall into a more aggressive, militaristic, Trump approach. But ultimately, I think what Trump cares about are three things. One, the stock market valuation. Two, GDP. And three, inflation. And of course, that is a gross simplification. It's reductionist, but it also explains a fair amount of what Trump is going to do. He's going to try to take actions that move those indicators in the direction he wants. If he believes that hugging Israel closely, providing maximal support is ultimately in the interest of those objectives, he will continue to do so. If he doesn't, he could turn on a dime. His advisors will try to rein him in. They may succeed, as they have in other cases, not with Israel, but more with Syria and the true presence. But there is this degree of indeterminacy because of just the sheer chaos of it. I mean, for Biden administration did not have a great process in terms of rigorousness. It was sloppy at times, but at least there was a process. I don't think there really is a process with President Trump. So I think we need to buckle our seatbelts and be prepared for abrupt turns, a lot of back and forth, and both everything is possible and everything is impossible. It's somewhat like Schrodinger's cat at the moment.
Indeed. Yes, indeed. And we have quite an interesting and complicated 4 years ahead of us, I don't doubt. Thank you so much, Andrew, for staying this extra time. Thank you so much for so many of our participants, the vast majority of which have stayed because they wanted to hear answers to these questions. And I know, based on the Q&A, that a number of folks found your comments on UNRWA especially helpful. So thank you so much for that, Andrew. Thank you, of course, to our other speaker, Dahlia Scheindlin, who joined us today as well. And thank you so much to all of our participants. It's been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.